Right over. Oh, so excellent. I'm seeing something come through.
Yes. Hopefully this will work properly. Can you see my Skyline screen yet?
Yes.
Yes.
Fantastic.
Are you starting a recording there, Nicole?
Yes, I am.
Excellent.
All right. Well, hopefully you're all here to learn about business analysis techniques for BI analysts. I think this is a really interesting topic, having worked on a few different BI projects over the course of my career as a consultant. And I've also had opportunities to kind of work directly with some BI folks at my own organization who wanted to learn more BA skills. So I think this is a really relevant topic for all of you. So just a little bit about me. A lot of you have heard me speak before, but I started out way back in the day at Netflix as a web publisher. Worked there when it was a startup company, and we literally had card tables for desks. They couldn't even afford like real desks. So that was way back. Then I transitioned to business analysis in 2005 as an opportunity that came about from a merger and acquisition. And I found that I was an analyst already. I'd already been doing analysis for pretty much my entire career in IT. So it was a very natural transition for me. Moved to Wisconsin 2010, joined Skyline in 2013, got multiple BA certifications and Agile certifications. And yes, I blame my husband for my name. If he says it's a link, sink, dink, or tink, then they're from Oostburg. I'm sorry, not Oostburg, Hingham. Well, they could be from Oostburg. They're both Dutch. Anyway, they're from Hingham,
You're in
Wisconsin.
trouble now.
I know. I can never do the shtick as well as you can, but they're Dutch and they're from Hingham, and he says it Hingham because that's how it's spelled. But anyway, moving on. Okay, so our agenda for today is to talk about 10 different common business analysis techniques. I'm going to cover each one of these kind of briefly. If you have questions, like Paul said, feel free to jump in. We're going to do kind of a shallow dive, not a deep dive. If anybody wants a deep dive on any one of these techniques, I'd be more than happy to come back at another meetup and do a deep dive. So this is our plan for today. And you can kind of think of it as a BA 101 primer course. You may already be familiar with a lot of these techniques. You may already do them sort of intuitively without having knowledge of the fact that they are official techniques as recognized by the IIBA, which is the International Institute of Business Analysis, where Denelkis works. So with that, I want to start with a question. All right, who can tell me in the audience, what is business analysis?
So for this, we're going to have people raise their hand, Rachel. You'd like that?
Yep, raise your hand or type it in
the hand button. There you go. Raise your hand in there. We'll see it on the participant list. The raised hands. No one's taking a shot at this?
Oh, come on, you guys. Be brave. Not a single taker? Okay, well, I'll give you the answer then. All right, so this is the official definition of business analysis from the IIBA, and it is that business analysis is the practice of enabling change in an enterprise by defining needs and recommending solutions that deliver value to stakeholders. Previously, in the most recent older version of the BABOK, which is the BA Book of Knowledge, the definition of business analysis was actually quite different. It pretty much described a BA as sort of a liaison between like IT and the business and kind of translating between those two groups. That definition has been evolving, and the Book of Knowledge has been evolving as well. So I think with this latest definition of business analysis, you're looking at BAs as much more strategic partners versus taking orders or taking instructions on what to do. We really want to understand the needs of the business versus just having them tell us what to do and going out and doing it. So just want to get a baseline here for understanding of what business analysis is, because I think everybody has a different opinion and might describe it differently. And as a business analyst, I find that I often have to educate my stakeholders and people about what business analysis is. But this is the organization that sort of had this become a real profession with a lot of rigor behind it and certifications and the body of knowledge. So that is what business analysis is. So the first technique I'm going to talk about here today is stakeholder analysis. So stakeholder analysis, why would you do this? Anybody have a guess as to why it's important to understand your stakeholders? This group's supposed to be interactive. Raise your hand.
Raise your hand on that participant list. I did.
Okay, so why do you think it's important?
Without deeper understanding, how can you hope to really meet the need?
Yeah,
That's what I'd say.
absolutely. I would say it's because you do need to understand who they are, what their interests are in the project, their level of support for or against an initiative. By identifying your stakeholders and analyzing them, then you'll know who you need to have at which activities, who you need to consult, who you need to just keep informed. And this will help you plan out your communications with your stakeholders at various levels. Also keeping in mind that different audiences will have different communication needs, right? So an example of that would be executives. They typically don't like to get down in the weeds. They don't want a lot of details. They want things at a summary level, which I'm sure all of you as BI professionals probably know, just sort of intuitively that you are not going to walk up to the president of your company and hand him a very detailed report. He will throw it back in your face and say, give me the summary version. So that's really important to understand about your stakeholders. And usually when I start any new project, it's like one of the first things I do is to figure out who are all the players. Who do I need to talk to? And stakeholder analysis is an activity that is something that you don't just do once at the beginning of a project. I think it's very important to point out that this should be an ongoing activity. People's views of the project may change over time. You might have someone who is a cheerleader at the beginning become a detractor towards the end. You need to understand those feelings and emotions, as well as who has decision-making authority, who has influence, etc. So you want to keep your stakeholder analysis ongoing throughout any sort of project or initiative. So there's a few pros and cons here. If you don't do this, you're going to be in trouble. I would say you really do need to understand who the people are, but really it helps you to organize your work, make sure you have the right people, and make sure you don't miss any stakeholders, because if you miss stakeholders, guess what you're going to have? Any guess? Anybody? Missed requirements. And you don't want to have any missed requirements, so you need to understand who your stakeholders are. So the process for conducting stakeholder analysis is kind of these 3 steps here, and this is a pattern you'll see kind of repeating throughout this presentation. But before you even start to identify your stakeholders, you want to make sure you understand what your project is about, right? So I would say go find any existing project documentation, and then make sure that you're able to kind of give the elevator pitch about the project if someone asks you about it. You don't want to go in there completely unprepared and not have any knowledge of why you're needing the stakeholders' time, right? So once you've done that, then you're ready to kind of start taking a look at the areas of the organization that are impacted. And from there, you can basically derive your list of stakeholders. Another activity that I generally do for any new project that I'm starting on is ask the company for organizational charts. That's going to help you get a context, right, for who's what, where people are located, what are the lines of authority between those people. I've interestingly found, and I heard there was someone from Schreiber Foods on the call, and some organizations are really tight about sharing their org charts. They actually think of it as kind of their intellectual property or strategic advantage. So some
Yeah.
companies will keep that information under tight wraps, and HR will own that org chart, and you can't see it without special permission. You can't copy it. You can't like take it out of the building. It's really interesting. But
I
some
can say that I've
organizations,
had that.
have
Yeah.
you experienced that
Yep.
as well? Yeah,
Yep. With Rampack, I basically started to put this together for our own BI and analysis, and it was like, we don't want you making an org chart. We don't want you figuring out who reports to who.
Right, right.
Okay.
So yeah, it was very odd. I have run into that as well. So just keep that in mind that you might run into that. But if you do run into that, you still need to understand how the organization is structured. So if I run into a situation like that, I will just make my own org chart. I will talk to the people, figure out who they are, and I will just very quickly throw together an org chart in Visio or draw.io or whatever, just so that I can have that view of who reports to who, et cetera, et cetera. It's really helpful to have that view. So let's see, once you have your list of stakeholders, then you want to analyze each individual, or it could be a group, or a group of people that have a similar role. And you'll want to determine who has authority, who doesn't, again, who has influence but can't necessarily make decisions, who can make decisions, and then how people feel about the change, because it's usually involving a change of some kind. And then you might even want to find out about their feelings or knowledge about business analysis, and if they even know what it is and why they're talking to you. So that's a really important educational piece that you might have to do. And I think that the title that we have, business analyst, is pretty generic, and I don't think it really describes well what we do. So some education may be required with those stakeholders. And you might have to, get them to understand and then get their buy-in and their cooperation. Not everybody's going to want to give you their time, so you're definitely going to need to make sure you get their buy-in. And then there's different methods that we can use to conduct stakeholder analysis, and there are a few listed here under methods, like lists, maps, matrices, diagrams, charts, personas. I'm not going to take a look at all of these in any level of detail, but I'll just give you a high level on a couple of them. So the first one is the power interest matrix. Have any of you seen this before? Raise your hand if you have. Anybody? Not a single one. Oh, this is great. Something new. I love it when I can teach new things.
Yeah.
All right, so this is a really useful chart that you don't necessarily want to share this out with anybody else, but as the analyst, you want to understand who falls into what sector, right? So once you have your stakeholder list, then you can evaluate each person and kind of put them somewhere on this chart so that you can understand what you need to do. And again, keep in mind that this could change, or your initial perception of the person might be wrong. So you might need to adjust this as you learn any new information. But by charting out the stakeholders' power and interest, you can then determine who you need to simply keep informed, who you need to keep an eye on, and who you need to really, really make happy, and who you need to exert influence over. So this is really easy to do. It doesn't take a lot of time. It's not overly complicated, but it's really just useful in figuring out who needs to know what, when, and why. All right, moving on to the next one. This one's called an onion diagram. Has anybody seen a chart like this before in terms of a stakeholder organization? Yeah, okay, cool. So this one starts with basically whatever you're doing, the system you're creating at the middle here, that's the first oval. Then you just start building out layers of your onion and the different people involved. And until you get all the way out to people kind of out there on the ancillary end of things. I find that this really helps you look at your stakeholders from a totally different perspective versus kind of just internally, which is where I think most people probably focus. But you can see here that there are stakeholders that are outside of this company that you might not have originally thought of as stakeholders. And keeping in mind that the definition of a stakeholder is anyone who has a stake or an impact or an interest, or they might be impacted by this initiative. So I really like to do this sort of at the beginning of a project with my team as a collaborative activity when I'm, launching the team and kicking off the project. So this is really helpful too. The next one here is called a RACI chart. Raise your hand if you're familiar with RACI charts. I'm hoping a good percentage of people are. Okay, good. This one shouldn't be too surprising. RACI stands for Responsible, Accountable, Consult, and Inform. There's also another slight variation on this that has an S in the name. I can't remember what that stands for off the top of my head, but there are different sort of flavors of this. So this has been a long time project management tool, but it is also useful if you're a business analyst. And if you have a separate project manager, you'll want to make sure you're collaborating with that person to make sure that you both have a shared understanding of who is responsible for what. You don't want to have two separate RACI charts that have different information that conflict. You have to work with your project manager and make sure you guys are on the same page and that everyone agrees with what's in this chart. This really just makes it clear who's responsible, who's accountable, who should be consulted and who should be informed. Helps the analysts when they're creating their communication plans. And it also ensures that any communications are appropriate to the level for the target audience. So that's one I have used many times in my past career. Probably depends on what type of methodology you're running with. If you're running waterfall, this is probably a pretty typical tool or technique that you would see. If you're running agile, maybe not so much, but I still think it's very useful. Whoops. So the next technique I want to talk about is document analysis. So what do you guys think this entails? Raise your hand, give an answer. Pretty please. No takers again. Oh, you guys are way too quiet tonight.
Well, you gotta see.
Reviewing existing documents.
There we go.
Yeah, pretty much, right? It's pretty straightforward. And it seems pretty simple when you think about it. However, don't assume that there will be any documentation. I've actually been giving client assignments for companies that literally had no documentation for existing production systems. Shocker, right? I just was blown away when I heard that, this company, which is a pretty large enterprise-sized company, and they had no documentation for the system that I was going to be working on. It was quite alarming. But basically, you're looking for information, about a system, and you want to look at anything that you possibly can that will give you information. So there are a couple limits to this technique. Obviously, the documentation has to be up to date. If it's old, it's not current, it's not going to be that valuable to you. It's also kind of difficult sometimes to find documentation. It can be spread all over the place. It can be with different people, different departments. It's almost like pulling teeth depending on the organization and their culture. But on the flip side, I would say some businesses, especially once they're regulated, have the opposite problem where they have an overabundance of documentation. And then sorting through all of it is like looking for a needle in a haystack, and gleaning meaningful information may be difficult, costly, and even time consuming. So there are advantages of using this technique if documents are available, so you're not really starting from scratch or square one. You at least have a baseline from which to work, and there could be even potentially some reusability within existing documentation. And reviewing documents can also help you identify other things such as business rules, which are distinctly different but related to requirements. And you might be able to use these to kind of cross-check your requirements that you got using other techniques, and making sure that there are no conflicts. But yeah, so you're looking for all these kinds of things, the rules, the entities or attributes, so you can start to build out your data models. It's also useful, especially when the person who may have had this knowledge is no longer available. If there's documentation, that's an advantage, because if somebody leaves and they had all the knowledge in their brain, then you're kind of dead in the water. Right, Moving on. So how do you conduct document analysis? Pretty easy. Well, it would seem like it's easy. Find out what documentation is available. You'll probably have to check with more than one person, depending on what it is you're trying to find. Once you have the documents in hand, then you review the documents and study them. You'll want to make note of any relevant information and then document your findings along with any follow-up questions that you have. Then follow through on your follow-up and close the loop on those questions. Once you have a list of requirements, then review them and confirm them with your stakeholders and document their confirmation. So pretty straightforward, I would say. Lots of places where you can find documents. These are just a few examples of possible document types that you may see. This is by no means a full list of document types. There could be many other types of documents that you might need to review. But when you look at them, just make sure that you're understanding the purpose of each document and the potential information it contains, and focus on documents that are likely to provide relevant information versus noise, which is just information you don't care about that can be found in a lot of documents. So it's kind of like a treasure hunt. Kind of, yeah, exactly. I mean, it can be fun, but it can also be extremely tedious. So, but
Tina asked a question.
Yeah.
Is this also part of source system analysis? Can they piggyback on each other?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, yeah, existing systems, totally. You could totally go poke around in existing systems, learn how they work. Yeah, absolutely. And they're both basically, you're looking at the current state of a system or a document, and really you're not going to get, no, I'm going to take that back. Never mind. Retracting thought. But yes, I would say they're somewhat analogous. Next up, we have interviews. I'm guessing every single person on this call has conducted an interview, so please raise your hand if you have. Tell me what the results are, because I can't see it.
We've got 9, 10, 9, 10.
Okay.
They're waffling. 9 people.
Okay, well, you've actually conducted interviews even if you don't think you have. I would say this is probably the most common of all BA techniques. However, that does not mean it's necessarily an easy thing to do or that it doesn't require preparation and skill. In fact, interviewing can be very challenging depending on a variety of factors. Interviews are generally one-on-one or in small groups. The analyst should prepare their list of interview questions in advance so that the stakeholders can review it and come prepared to answer the questions. It's not always possible to do that, but it's a courtesy that I think a lot of stakeholders appreciate. Also, if you're able to get a scribe, so someone who will take notes for you, that'll really help when you're doing your interviews, so you can actually focus on the information you're trying to glean versus writing down notes about it and trying to remember things. So that is a luxury not everybody always can have, but if you do have that opportunity, say an intern or a junior analyst who's just learning how to be a BA, those are really great opportunities for them to play that part and help you. I've also found that if you don't have a scribe, if you can get permission from the person you're interviewing to record the session, that's really helpful, because then again, you do not necessarily have to take notes. You can focus on what you're doing with the interview, trying to get the answers to your questions, and then you can always go back and re-listen to that interview and take notes that way. Not as efficient, obviously, as having a scribe there, but it's actually a really great way to make sure you don't miss anything or misunderstand anything. Let's see, so there are 2 different types of interviews, and these are as defined by the IIBA. Basically, all of these techniques and the information I'm sharing kind of are sourced from the BA box, so the BA Book of Knowledge. So structured, which means you're coming into the interview with a set of predefined questions that you come up with in advance and structure in a logical order. And then there are also unstructured interviews. So those are a little more free form. You're just kind of having a discussion. you probably have some sort of overarching goal, or maybe you're just at the beginning and you want to get, a broad sense of something. So depending on what the situation is, you'll want to choose the interview type as appropriate. So let's see. I would say the unstructured option really focuses more on the open-ended type questions, and they allow the interviewee to elaborate. I do think both of these types of interviewing can be effective, but you need to also take your cues from your stakeholder. Success is really dependent on all these factors that are listed here, like how much you as the interviewer already knows, how experienced you are as an interviewer, how willing the person being interviewed wants to be interviewed, and their willingness to answer your questions. Don't always assume that your interviewee is in favor of your project or initiative. I've encountered people, and you may have as well, who are resistant to participate or provide any information because they feel threatened in some way. Like a good example of this would be if you're working on a project to automate a task that some person used to manually do, and that's part of their job. So they might feel that their job is being threatened. So it's really important when you're interviewing those folks to couch it in such a way that it's a positive for them, that it's not necessarily a negative, that we're not taking away part of your job, we're freeing up your time to be able to do more valuable things for the organization. And that's a really important way to frame that up so that the person will be more receptive to providing you with the information. So you could encounter some resistance, so just be aware of that as a possibility, and do your homework on the stakeholders kind of before you go into an interview. You'll want to have conducted that stakeholder analysis before you ever set up an interview with a person. Finally, you want to make sure you're establishing rapport with your stakeholders. If they know you and trust you, they'll be much more likely to share the information that you're looking to discover. All right.
And you know what helps that, folks? Webcams. I saw you turn them off. I did.
Actually, that's a really, really good point. In fact, I wrote a blog recently in response to the whole COVID-19 and everybody working from home. And I mean, I've been a remote worker for, the better part of the last 10 years. And it was really easy for me to just brain dump this, blog on ways to make remote events more successful, and one of them is to turn on your camera for sure. Yep. So yes, and one person on my team does it every single time, almost like peer pressure to the rest of the team to try to get us to turn on theirs, but nobody else is taking the bait. Unless we're having a virtual happy hour, then we will all turn on our cameras and have a drink together.
Very good.
All right, I diverged. All right, so let's get into how to, pros and cons first. So I think that interviews are extremely effective. One-on-one interviews are especially useful because people are much more willing to share information honestly and directly with a single person without the influence of others, right? So if you've got your boss in the room, or if you've got an underling, not underling, a subordinate is a better word, in the room, people might not be honest or give you the full information that you need because they feel kind of pressure to act in a certain way. So the one-on-one interview, I think, is especially effective. It's also great because it allows you as the analyst to observe the other person's nonverbal communication. And the same thing would go with turning on the camera. You can't necessarily understand the information that's being communicated via body language, if you can't see the person. Face-to-face is the most effective way to communicate. So I would definitely say do it in person. If it's in any way possible, it's preferable. And then you can gauge the people's feelings. You can't do that if you can't see them. And this format also allows you to quickly ask follow-up questions and get answers right away so that you don't have to wait. There are a couple drawbacks of interviews, though. Obviously, the one-on-one is timely and expensive. Not timely, time-consuming. It's also not necessarily good at achieving consensus. So if you need to get a bunch of people to agree, then single individual one-on-one interviews is not going to get you there very quickly. If you have conflicting information, then you're going to have to go back and forth until you get that consensus. So that's also an expensive proposition. The interviewer also has to be trained in how to interview. So that's a skill, right? It's not a skill that everyone naturally possesses. Some may, but others don't. But you can learn how to interview well. And then any outputs of the interview, though, have to be cautious about those because they could be subject to bias by the interviewer or the interviewer's interpretation. So you could think they meant something, but they may have meant something else. So you need to be very clear. And also, it's possible that interviewers could lead the person. So I hope you guys know what that means, where you want them to go a certain direction. Like, let's say your company said, we have to use Oracle, but we're trying to give the impression that we haven't already picked Oracle. So kind of help the person like along that path to say it's okay to use Oracle, for example. So you don't want to do that. You need to be impartial. You need to be objective. As a business analyst, I am system agnostic, okay? I don't care what system or how you accomplish the goal, the business goal. I want to choose the best tool for the job, right? So I'm not going to go in there and say, I'm working for a Microsoft shop or a Microsoft partner, so thou shalt use Power BI. You know, that's not how you do it. So just be careful of that. All right, let's see. And then obviously, if you don't have a scribe and you can't record the interview, then it's, you're going to have to do double duty there, taking notes, asking questions, pausing, taking notes. So that can be more time consuming and expensive too. So just if you don't have the luxury of having a scribe or being able to record, just plan a little extra time for your interview because of that fact. You want to make the most out of the time that you have with the stakeholder. Okay, so the process. Basically, you figure out who you need to interview, and then you need to understand where they're coming from or what their stake is in the project. And then you need to find the person who has the most accurate source of truth. You might be in an organization where there's a bunch of people who have similar information, but you probably don't need to talk to each and every one of them, right? You want to get to the person who's got the most valid information. Then when you're conducting the interview, you have a choice of using either closed-ended or open-ended questions or a combination. Open-ended questions will get you more information and closed-ended questions can help you get confirmation. So you guys are all BI people, so you get the Boolean concept of yes or no. That's basically what we're going for here. You want to maybe start out with open-ended questions, and then as you're asking clarifying questions, narrow that down until you get to the end where you can ask a yes or no type of a question and get your true or false answer there. So they're very helpful to understand those different types. Now, you want to be aware that some people aren't very willing to open up. Some people don't want to be interviewed. They don't want their brains picked, and they're not going to be very conversive with you. They are going to kind of keep a tight lip, and if that happens, you might have to impromptu switch up your approach and just start sticking with closed-ended questions. If you can't get someone to open up, then that's the thing I would advise is just switch it up, get answers yes or no, and then move on. And you'll want to structure the ordering of your questions in a logical way, right, so that the interviewee can follow along. Again, if you can get a scribe, yay. And then when you schedule the interview, of course, be respectful of the interviewee's schedule. Flex around it if necessary. When you send out the invitation, be sure to include the purpose of the interview with an agenda and then the expected outcome of the session. And then when you conduct the interview, you ask your questions, you get your answers, have a dialogue, and then when you're done, make sure you organize your notes and prepare them and provide a copy to the person who was interviewed and make sure that you got everything correct. It's very easy in communication to, get things lost in translation, misunderstandings, having that review and opportunity for the person to say, yes, that's what I said, or no, you need to make this adjustment, make sure that you're on the same page. Couple best practices in conducting interviews. There is a format to interviews. You know, you want to open the interview and state why you're there, what you're trying to achieve. You want to make sure that you have them express any initial concerns that they might have, and kind of talk about the process of how the interview will go. Um, your opening, again, should include the introduction. Make sure you get to know the person a little bit. And again, keep in mind the stakeholder. Some stakeholders don't want chit chat. They want to get down to business and they just want to get in and get out. So you need to kind of understand that as a part of your stakeholder analysis before you go into this meeting. If they don't want small talk, don't give them small talk. Don't try to engage in, do you like to golf, or, anything along those lines. You just want to keep it to business. That's how you need to approach those people. Other people are the opposite. They want to establish a relationship. They want to have the conversation about who your, husband is, your kids are, like what you do for fun, et cetera, et cetera. So make sure you understand that about your stakeholders, and that will help you gain their trust and establish that rapport. During the interview, you want to stay focused on your questions, especially if you're doing a structured interview. If it's unstructured, be sure to take really good notes and practice active listening. Does everybody know what active listening is? I hope and pray that everybody on the call knows what that is. It's where you pay attention and you reflect back and you make sure that that you're understanding them correctly. You're getting confirmation of that. So don't be distracted by other things. Make sure your mind is focused and you're paying attention to the person so you can truly understand. That's the goal. One thing that I do when I'm getting close to the end of interviews is I will ask, is there anything else? And, people don't like silence, so they're going to fill that void when you ask them that question for the most part. Some people will say no, but for the most part, people will be like, well, there's this other thing. And then they'll elaborate, they'll keep going. And then I let them do that. And then I ask them the question again, maybe in a slightly different way, but I keep asking the question until they don't have anything more to say. And then I know that I have drained their brain and got everything that I can out of that person. And then one final tip that I do is I also ask, is there anyone else that I should talk to? Because sometimes you could miss a stakeholder despite all of your best efforts in conducting your stakeholder analysis. Somebody might have kind of just that tribal knowledge and you don't have that anywhere in org chart or anywhere else. So I always ask that question too. And
Do you
then,
feel there's a question from the audience? Tina was
yes.
asking, do you feel this is more to process, best practice, and things to understand current processes, or gather requirements for the new, or both?
Both, I would say. You need to understand the current state. So your first interview could be, what are all your pain points? What is it today about the system that drives you crazy? What is it that you hate? How do you do it today? And getting that understanding of that current state. And then you could have a follow-up interview that's, okay, so what does your desired future state look like? If we could solve all these pains for you, what would your ideal situation be? So I'd say you could use it you can use an interview in any situation, really. It's very flexible.
Now, I'm imagining a world where, you're already having probably some difficulties getting these people's times, and they're maybe realistic resistant to getting interviewed. So
Mm-hmm.
now we're talking about breaking it down between understanding current and gathering new requirements. And it's kind of, well, you might have two interviews. I'm like, I might not be able to get one. So
You could combine it, right? You could just say quickly, tell me how you do things today. You could even do a whiteboarding session as part of the interview. Just do a quick flow chart and then kind of sketch out the desired future state right there and then. I mean, you could totally do that. There's nothing to say you can't keep this more fluid, right? It just depends on what the goal is for the interview. So you can combine multiple techniques like that, absolutely.
sure, great.
Anyway, moving back to the last step here. So summarizing, what you heard, reminding them about any next steps, and of course, always, always, always thank the person for their time. People's time is precious. Time is the one thing we can never get back once we've spent it. So thank you guys for spending it with me tonight. But you want to make sure that they feel appreciated, that their time was valued by you, and that both of you got something out of it. So these are just some best practices to keep in mind for interviews. Alrighty, workshops. So this is very similar to interviews, but it involves a lot more people. And it's more of a structured way to get requirements from many different stakeholders kind of all at the same time. It does require a skilled facilitator to run a workshop, and this is a skill that can be learned. It's definitely not something that's, again, necessarily intuitive to everyone. It takes practice, but it involves getting multiple stakeholders together at the same time and hashing out requirements for a solution. It can be kind of intense, but I think it can yield very productive results. And the process of getting consensus, unlike with individual interviews, is much easier using this technique. And then one of the main benefits is that you can get a lot of information in a short amount of time. It's very collaborative, the feedback is immediate. The analyst doesn't have to meet with every stakeholder, so it's less expensive. The main drawback is that it's usually kind of hard to get all the right people together at the same time. And it definitely relies on the business knowledge of the stakeholders. So you have to get the right people in there with the right level of knowledge. And also you don't want to have too many people because then it gets challenging. You want to have just the right amount of people. So there's a little bit of nuance here with trying to get workshops right, but um, it's a really good technique to just do things very quickly. One other drawback is that if you have too few people, then again, you're running the risk of missing out on requirements. So to do a workshop, you get ready. It's very similar to interviewing. You could possibly do interviews like individual pre-workshop interviews just to get prepped. But make sure you include the purpose, that you have the right logistics, right? You got to have a whiteboard and pens and paper, etc., whatever you need to, do the facilitation. You don't want to like show up unprepared without those kinds of things. You want to keep the group on focus if you're the facilitator. Make sure that you're trying to gain consensus and keep the team on track. And then close with any open action items or follow-up activities, and then document your findings and share them with your sponsor. Right, moving on. Observation, or also known as job shadowing. Has anybody done this? Raise a hand. Few?
3, 5.
Okay, that's
All right.
about 10. Oh, I'm not good at math. Never mind. All right. So why would you do this? It sounds kind of invasive to me, doesn't it? A little bit. And maybe it kind of is, but it's also a really effective technique for seeing how things and processes happen in the real world. And I recommend that everyone try this technique at least once in their career. This really boils down to watching someone do their job and then taking note of what they're doing. You could use this technique when you even, here's a good example. My husband was getting his master's degree, and one of his assignments was to observe the wait staff at a bar. So he didn't tell them that he was doing this, but usually you would in our profession. But basically he just came in with a notepad and started jotting down every single thing that like the bartender was doing and the different people at the organization. And from that he understood like what's their workflow, where do they have, bottlenecks and those kinds of things. Which is really interesting. So you could try that out just as a little experiment. But there's two types of observation: passive, or invisible as they also call it, and then active, or visible. And the first one is really, you're just an observer. You're not allowed to interfere with the person or ask questions of the person who's being observed. And the other type is active. So in that situation, you can actively ask them questions. You can interact with them as they're doing their job. You could ask them to narrate as they're doing things. And you really want to just watch as close as you can to get an accurate picture of how they actually work as the process unfolds. A lot of times you're going to find there are things that people do in their job that are not documented in any flowchart anywhere. they have these little extra things. I have to check with so-and-so, or I have to do this, or I have to do that. And you're not ever going to see that written down. It's just part of the internal process that the person does. There's many, many different, steps a person takes that are probably not documented, but they are part of the process. And this activity can really help you uncover those things so that you can account for them. Great. So the main benefit here is that you're viewing reality, and it helps you document how things are really done versus how they're documented that they're being done. But there are a couple drawbacks as well. This really works only for current state systems or processes, can be kind of time consuming. And then also, because the person knows they're being watched, they could change their behavior, which could kind of skew what you're seeing. And also, if the work that you're watching is highly cognitive, like thinking, and you can't see them think. So that can be kind of difficult to identify. And that's where I would recommend that you have the person speak out loud as they're doing things, tell you what they're thinking, why they're doing what they're doing as they're doing it. So that kind of helps get around that problem a little bit. But it can also be kind of disruptive to the person, and they might feel like they're being judged. So you always want to make sure you start out by letting them know why you're doing it and that you're not threatening them in any way. You're just watching what they're doing. All right, so to do this, obviously you want to figure out what you're going to be watching and who you want to watch, and then decide if you're going to do active or passive, visible or invisible. And then, yeah, make sure you tell the person what you're doing, reassure them that you're not there to, take their job away. You're just there to observe and understand the current state process. Again, the thinking aloud really helps for those cognitive activities, and then record what you're seeing and taking notes as you go. If you use the active type of observation, make sure you're asking probing questions like, why did you do that? Why did you go there? Those kinds of things. You want to understand their process. If you observe more than one person, like you could do this one at a time with different people, you'll want to then compile your kind of overall results and review the findings with your stakeholders. All right, next up we've got surveys and questionnaires. Who's ever received a survey or questionnaire? If you didn't get your census and fill it out, you're in big trouble with the government.
Yeah, 8.
Okay,
9.
so how many of you have actually created and distributed a survey or questionnaire? Couple? Anybody?
We got 7 still raising their hands.
Okay.
So yeah, it's good.
Okay, so all right, cool. So surveys are really great if you have a really large audience that you want to get information from, or if you're looking to get feedback quickly. In those two instances, surveys are a good technique for you to use. Surveys can, again, similar to interviews, include open or closed-ended questions. Closed-ended questions are useful for getting quantifiable data, whereas open-ended questions allow people to elaborate, right? So that usually will require some additional analysis to find themes or trends, and sometimes follow-up as well. So advantages and disadvantages: surveys are quick, cheap, and they can be sent out to a lot of people all at the same time. Assuming you design a relatively short and targeted survey, they're quick and easy for the respondents to reply to. But people get kind of tired of answering surveys, and it does require some skill to draft the survey questions to make sure that your results will be unbiased. So if you do use a lot of open-ended questions, you're probably going to have to do follow-up. If you don't get a large enough response rate, then you also run the risk that your results are not statistically relevant. So a couple of pros and cons there. To prepare a survey, you obviously just decide what the purpose is of the survey. Make sure your survey questions, prepare your survey questions, choose a target audience, choose how you're going to distribute the survey. Obviously, most people aren't doing the old school, mail it and then wait for it to come back. Most people are doing online surveys, census aside. but you want to make sure that you have a good wide distribution so that you can make sure your results are meaningful. And you also want to make sure you're following your company's policies in terms of distribution and make sure that people's personal information is protected. Otherwise, you could open yourself up to a lawsuit or something, so be careful there. Once you receive your responses, then you collate them and you analyze results. And again, if you do a lot of open-ended questions, that's going to require more time and analysis and follow-up. So a few things to consider when you are designing your survey. You know, you can choose a homo or a heterogeneous audience where they're either all this very similar or all very different, depending on what your purpose is. You want to make sure the purpose is very clear. Be sure that your questions are also clear and unambiguous and that it's short enough to complete within just a few minutes. If it takes longer than that, people are going to just, you know, stop and not finish. And you really want to get this data. So there's many, many tools out there. These are just a couple that I'm aware of. Have any of you guys used any of these specific tools for surveys?
I have, yeah. SurveyMonkey.
Yeah, SurveyMonkey is kind of the most popular one that I'm aware of.
Andrea, you got your hand raised. What do you use? No? Nick? They got their hands raised.
Well, these are, yeah, so these are kind of some mostly online ones. There's another set, I'm sure that's more enterprise level, like the company that I'm working at right now uses a tool called Qualtrics. So I'm sure they're, you know, they run the gamut in terms of what they can do and how much they cost. So pick appropriately and make sure that your organization approves of you using that tool too. You don't want to start sending out surveys and, you know, get whacked for doing something your organization doesn't approve of.
Yeah, Andrea just said she uses Qualtrics too, yeah.
Okay, yeah. All right, so you probably have used functional decomposition before, which is the next technique, and or organizational modeling. Even if you didn't know it, it's just kind of a fancy title. I'd say it's very analogous to like a work breakdown structure if you're familiar with that concept from project management. But basically, you're just breaking down a system or process into smaller functional chunks until you've identified all the functional primitives. And then organizational modeling is really just creating a visual representation of how an organization is structured. So back to the org charts that you wanted to look at in the stakeholder analysis technique. So there's a few different structures that organizations can take, like hierarchical or matrix, and most people can look at these visual models and really easily understand what they represent. They really help make a complex thing less complex, more simple to understand, and also gain a shared understanding. Couple drawbacks though, depending on how big this is, you might not be able to fit this all like on a single functional decomposition diagram, you know, for large and complex systems. And then in org charts, sometimes there are informal lines of authority. Has anybody been in that situation before where you had like 2 or 3 bosses all at the same time, only one that had a line to you on the org chart, but you had to report to these other people too? I've been in that situation many times, especially as a consultant, and it's interesting. But anyway, so to perform this technique, basically you want to break things down, and it's pretty logical, I think. You just kind of start at the top and work your way down into chunks until you have something that's really understandable and easy. I don't think there's really too much to it. I bet you've all done something like this before. Everybody raise your hand if you've done something like a functional decomposition chart before. Just breaking down the process or...
Yeah, 4, 5 people.
Yeah, so the next slide here kind of just gives some examples. So the one on the left is an FDD. The one on the right is an org chart that's more of a matrix type chart. So I think it's pretty straightforward. And if you haven't used this before, well, this is a good opportunity to try it out. All right, prototyping. This is one of my passions. It's a really quick and easy way to test a design, get feedback, and iterate until you have a design, you know, that represents what you need. They can be created at multiple different levels of fidelity. Are you guys familiar with the word fidelity? So low
No.
fidelity would be like, think drawing on a napkin. And then high fidelity would be like polished digital prototype that represents the final design. Oops, sorry. There are also different types of prototypes. So we've got horizontal models that they take a very shallow but wide view of a system, and then vertical models that go deep down into like a narrow slice. Prototypes can be disposable, which they're called throwaway, or they can be, and those tend to be low fidelity, and then they could also be evolutionary, and you can use that to actually create working software. But in that case, the work is preserved, so it's not lost. And depending on the type and level of prototype, this can be really quick and a very cheap way to prove out a concept prior to writing a single line of code. Jen Calls has a really good presentation from a few years back from WeBad on prototyping, if anybody's interested in going into that in more detail. There's a bunch of advantages of prototyping. Obviously, it's quick, it's visual. Most people are very visual. They're cheap generally, and they help surface unknown requirements. And in your case, you're probably going to do a lot of report prototypes, right? You could sketch something out, say, here's what it's going to look like, or you could do a visualization. Those are the kinds of prototypes I would imagine you folks doing for the most part.
Yeah.
Yeah, which I think would be, really helpful. Again, people are visual and they don't know what they want until they see it, literally. But if your system's large and complex, then prototyping could be a long, time-consuming activity, and it could be expensive. So it depends, what you need and what level you need it at. One drawback of high fidelity prototypes is that it might lead your stakeholders to have unrealistic expectations about the delivery of the system. They see it, they think it's working because it's like a working prototype, but there's no code behind it. It's all fake, right? And nothing has been written to actually make this thing real. So that's just one caution. I would say if you're going the high fidelity route, just make sure that it's well understood before you show them that this is not working. There's a lot of work yet to do. This is just to show you the concepts and get your feedback so we can get the design to where we want it before we invest the heavy lifting in putting the parts in place to make it work. So the process, first you decide which approach you're going to use, define the scope of what you're going to model, then you create high-level views, get feedback, add detail, iterate, and then once you get to a design that's acceptable to your stakeholders, then align the visual design and the other supporting objects. And this is where the BI part comes in, right? Data entities, attributes, then we've got the details like acceptance criteria, business rules, etc. So make sure you have anything on the design and make sure it traces back to the business case, and then you can get approval from your stakeholders when the design meets the requirements. So there's, again, many tools for prototyping besides the ones at the bottom, paper, pencil, whiteboard. Balsamiq is a really quick and easy one, pretty cheap. iRise is expensive, high-end, high learning curve. Figma is one that my UX designer on the project I'm on right now uses. Axure is one that we at Skyline use as our tool of choice. You could use Visio, like there's nothing that says you can't use Visio. Everybody's probably got it, or most people have it if you're an analyst. Adobe XD is one that I recently came into contact with that I love. So there's lots of options out there. There's probably many, many others. And I just threw this stupid prototype together here. It's just a fake thing that I made up. So I don't know that I'm the most skilled designer in the world, but hey, it was real quick and dirty to put this together. Right, 9 reviews. Okay, who knows what a review is? Oh, come on. Somebody better answer this question.
Go ahead, Ashley. She raised her hand. Come on, Ashley.
Yeah, sorry, I had trouble hitting the mute button. I do reviews after I've documented requirements with stakeholders to make sure that everyone agrees.
Absolutely correct. Gold star. Yeah, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's getting together with your stakeholders and reviewing your artifacts to verify and validate and ultimately get approval on. I'd say in waterfall projects or traditional, this is generally more of a formal activity, right? You're going to have a requirements review or a formal walkthrough with the stakeholders and the project team who will develop the application. And I've done that, many times in the first part of my career, which was, pretty much all waterfall. Last 10 years, I've been doing more agile. So that's a little bit different. It tends to be more informal and on a regular basis throughout the project rather than more at the beginning. The benefit of conducting a review is that it ensures that everyone, again, like you said, has a shared understanding of the requirements, that there are no open questions, there's no ambiguity, no gaps. The disadvantage, especially with waterfall, is that it might take several review session cycles. So you might do a review, there's a lot of change or a lot of comments or feedback that comes out of it. You have to go update the documentation and then you have to do it again and again until everybody agrees and you get it 100% perfect, right? So that's very time consuming and costly, and it definitely is a disadvantage. Okay, so how to conduct a review: invite the right people, send out what you want to have reviewed in advance so that they can look at it. Here's what I found though from my past in especially waterfall. The stakeholders don't ever look at what you send them before. They're looking at it for the first time in the meeting. Who's experienced that? I want to know, just for my own personal edification.
We got 3, 4, 6,
Okay.
7,
Yeah.
8.
Yeah, by and large, I'd say stakeholders are busy. They don't have time to look, especially in waterfall. Like I literally wrote specs that were, maybe a couple hundred pages long. And nobody's going to look at that. Like nobody's going to look at that. And so, just be prepared that you might have to take a bit of extra time because they didn't look at it in advance. But when the meeting begins, obviously make your introductions just like any other good meeting, lay out the ground rules. Make sure that here's one that I think is important. Make sure that the person who created the document, their supervisor is not in the room. I mean, that's probably not necessarily realistic, but that's the advice that I would give because that person's got a totally different interest in what's going on, and it's going to make the person doing the review, sharing their work, nervous. And I just don't think it's a good practice, and that's my opinion. But anyway, review the scope, the objectives, and then do the review. Obviously, if there's questions, comments, feedback, record those. Again, it helps to have a scribe in this situation as well. And if there's anything that you can come to consensus on, great. If you can get that approval the first time, shocking, but great. And then development can proceed. And if modifications are needed, then again, rinse and repeat.
The question occurs to me, Rachel, on this kind of reviews process is, as I've refined how I might want to do the kind of review or after action or a hot wash, because they can get to be charged or political or uncomfortable or this and
Yeah.
that, they tend not to happen. So I have moved in the direction where I try and err on the side of keeping it light, quick, no more than half an hour. It's not about finger pointing or this and that. It's just about can we grab some brainstormy like improvements and get past just getting people in a room or stakeholders or something to contribute a review or a lessons learned, rather than a huge process. So when sometimes the BAs I work with come in with okay, well, we need a thing like this all filled out as lessons learned, 15 category list with a bunch of stuff, and I'm kind of like, that has led in every place I've worked toward these eventually dying off. So
Yes,
I want to err
absolutely.
on the side of keeping this kind of stuff small, quick, and just
Yes, I'm all for
spend a
that.
lot of
And especially having been working in Agile for the, last almost decade, I really prefer that over this, traditional process. I think it's much more effective to have very frequent interactions with your product owner, almost I would have a daily meeting with my product owner if I were acting as the BA on the project, and it's very collaborative. You know, they're going to see everything as it develops. Your items that you're reviewing are much smaller. The problem with that is that you might lose sight of the big picture. So a little bit of drawback there too. Okay, so this is just a list of a potential checklist of questions that you could have for a review to make sure that you're ticking all the boxes, right? Making sure that there aren't any issues, no typos, no ambiguous language. You've got acceptance criteria or validation criteria. You've got all the models that you need, et cetera, et cetera. And this will look different from project to project. For a BI project, I would imagine this list would be dramatically different, probably, having to do with all the, the data elements and data definitions and data flow and data stores and ETL and all those things you guys do. So just try to put together some kind of a checklist that makes sense at your organization so that you're making sure you've got everything accounted for. All right, last but not least, this is dear and near to my heart. Who knows what non-functional requirements are? Nicole, speak up. Anybody? Nobody?
No, I don't think you got anybody.
Oh my goodness. Okay, well, if you don't remember anything else from this presentation, remember this one. This is important. This one can come back to bite you in the butt if you do not address it. It's probably the most difficult type of requirements to elicit and document. It's an area of requirements that is often overlooked, and I can guarantee you that if you don't address this, you will regret it. These are the requirements that have nothing to do with the functionality of the system itself. Rather, they're about the quality attributes of the system, and they're extremely important to consider. And I learned this lesson very much the hard way. I won't give you the company that I was working at, but it was a mobile application that was being built, and it was being run as an agile project. And that's one of the perils of agile, I think, is that non-functionals tend to fall through the cracks. But anyway, I thought I wrote some great user stories, some great acceptance criteria, and everything when it was developed worked as specified. You know, it did what it was supposed to do, but it was slow as molasses. The performance was pathetic. It took way too long for a screen to load on a mobile device, which is totally unacceptable for, mobile users. So nailed it on the functional part, completely failed it on non-functionals. So non-functionals are essential to keep track of, and I'm going to show you some of the more common ones in a minute. But having non-functional requirements documented helps ensure that you have a higher quality system. The issue then is identifying which non-functionals to focus on, because there are gazillions of them, and they're really hard to nail down. And in order to be useful, they have to be measurable constraints against which the system can be tested. And it's also possible to overdo it on the non-functionals because there are so many to choose from, and it could very quickly bloat the requirements and increase the cost or complexity of your system. So the main point here is just to be aware of the key types and make sure you're addressing them some way, somehow, somewhere. All right, so the list on the left is some of the most common ones. So my clue whenever I see ility at the end of a word is that that's probably a non-functional requirement. They don't all end in that way, like performance, obviously, but availability, compatibility, functionality. No, that shouldn't be on this list. Never mind. Scratch that. I don't know how that ended up on here. Maintainability, etc. So I'll just go through these quickly so you can understand what each of them entails. So availability is really the degree to which the solution is operable and accessible when needed, and it's usually expressed in some kind of percentage of the time the solution's available. So it might need to be available 99.97% of the time. And for especially like websites, that could be a real number for them. They could have very little downtime to do maintenance. They want their available site to be on 24/7, right? Next one is compatibility, which is the degree to which the solution operates effectively with other components in the environment, which I think everyone's probably pretty familiar with compatibility. Maintainability, so the ease with which a system or component can be modified to correct faults, improve performance or other attributes, or adapt to a change in the environment. Performance efficiency is the degree to which a solution or component performs its design functions with minimum consumption of resources, and can be defined based on the context or the period, such as high peak, mid peak, off peak. Portability is the ease with which a solution can be transferred from one environment to the other. Reliability, is that on the list? No, it's not. It should be. Reliability should be on there. Sorry about that. The ability of a solution to perform under stated conditions for a specified period of time. Scalability, the degree to which a solution is able to grow or evolve to handle increased amounts of work. Security, aspects of the solution that protect it from, malicious access, modification, destruction, disclosure. And then usability is the ease with which a user can learn the solution. So those are just some of them. There are a lot. Like if you Googled it, you would find, you could find a list with 100 different types of non-functionals on it. But these are the key ones to pay attention to.
Yeah, if I
And
could interject, Dave
Yeah.
Latorelle made a point that this is so huge that he's wanting to reinforce it in the chat. So, Dave, you want to say a moment about what you mean when you say the BI project using a matrix to align these objectives to the business objectives? I'm putting you on the spot, I know, but I think you got something good to share there.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Come on, Dave. Your
Deep
mic
brains.
is out. You're right. Your mic is out.
Oh,
Okay.
bummer.
Well,
Uh-huh.
I
I
will
buy
speak
that.
for him then, and I will say yes. This slide is super important to have the things that aren't necessarily their top functional requirement, what they're thinking of on the business side,
Yep.
and have a part in a matrix in a BI space to say, okay, we've covered, what you hope to get out of this BI project data wise, this and that, but here's a couple other, things we'll just quick run through to make certain we're on the same page around how available you expect this to be and how fast it'll scale up. So scalability, those jump out at me. Very, very kind of important. So
Yeah, absolutely. The key is to make them measurable, right? It's easy to say it needs to be easy to use, but what does that mean? How can you measure that? How can you test that? Unless you can make it measurable, you can't validate it, you can't test it. So you have to put numbers behind each of these. And that is the hard part. That is the really hard part, because ask a stakeholder, like, how portable does it need to be? Like, what does it need to be ported to? I mean, you have to figure out the answers to those questions, and it's very difficult. There's whole presentations just on this one topic that are out there that you could go take a look at because of how important it is. So I just always emphasize whenever I'm doing any kind of BA training that you should never ever forget this piece. Hugely important, and people tend to forget about it. They really do. They don't think about these things until the very end, and then it's too late. Then you're going to have a big problem on your hands that you could have avoided by thinking about this early and often.
Sure. Yep. Thanks.
So these are just a couple examples of different non-functional requirements. So website should be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I would put actually the percentage, right? Because that's not really realistic. So I didn't create these examples. I stole them off of a different presentation. So I wouldn't actually like that one. And maybe not a few of these either, but at least they've got numbers on them, which is a good place to start. So with that, I complete the portion of brain dumping 10 techniques for business analysis on BI projects. And I intentionally want to say that I didn't include anything about data modeling, data dictionary. Like, we've talked about those in the past, and I assume you guys are all experts on all things data. So there are a ton of BA techniques related to data modeling, context diagrams, blah blah blah. You know, there's lots and lots of official techniques, but I figure you guys are the experts already. If you can't read an ERD, then you're in trouble in your job, right?
That's maybe fair. It's maybe fair, but if you're opening up for questions now, this is
Yeah.
the time to kind of find that unmute button and feel free to jump in with a question here. There's about 15 of us left on the call, so this would be great. I don't think anybody's going to step over each other if you jump in. I have one that I noted for this QA section. When you were doing the stakeholder analysis section, one thing that occurred to me was tapping into existing ways to understand other stakeholders in the company. If the company uses some things like Myers-Briggs or True Colors or DISC, is that something that you see any concerns, have any comments on using that to understand your stakeholders?
I haven't seen that as a analysis technique per se, but I think it's a fantastic idea. I have seen some of my clients use it. I think one of my clients used, like, it had something to do with an animal that represented like their personality, and I thought that was cute. But my company, we use DISC, and I do think that that's a very useful tool to understand where other people are coming from, where, you know, how they might perceive you, how you can adapt yourself to other people's styles and personalities. So absolutely, I think that's a totally valuable tool. And I love Myers-Briggs too. Do you know what yours is?
Yes, mine is high C, high S, very low I.
Oh, interesting. I'm not going to tell you
so.
what mine is because you probably wouldn't guess it, but
high I maybe?
yes, actually.
Yes.
I'm very introverted, believe it or not. Yes. I fake it really well.
I'm a big proponent of DISC profiles at work, and so part of what occurred to me when you were talking about interviews was the fact that, you know, getting a sense of whether your interviewee is really wants to get over quick or, you know, likes details. Some of that knowledge in your stakeholder analysis helps you know how to conduct your interviews. So
absolutely. And
I thought I saw a hand raise for Kevin Ducat. Did you have something? No?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Rachel. That was some great stuff. Just a question for you, just get your perspective. You know, my organization, I'm mainly in the IT side, so we're, you know, kind of doing a lot of the BA kind of development, testing, and kind of all the pieces, you know, in the development process. But I was curious on your take for testing, like where do you kind of fit yourself into that process with, you know, kind of, I know with that first definition, you know, you said the liaison between IT and the business, but I just wanted your take on that process. And
yeah, absolutely. So officially, testing has nothing to do with business analysis. Testing is not a part of the job of a business analyst, according to the BA Book of Knowledge from the IIBA. However, in the real world, BAs are often tasked with also doing testing. And I've been in situations where, you know, you have to wear multiple hats, especially this is true in smaller organizations. You know, in your larger organizations, you're probably going to be lucky enough to have a QA, separate QA competency set, and, you know, different people have that skill set. So technically speaking, it's not a part of what a BA is meant to do, but everything that a BA does feeds into that quality analyst job, right? So if you're writing acceptance criteria, those essentially become the input for a QA analyst to then go write more detailed test cases. So business analysts tend to think more happy path, and QA analysts by training are more, they're trying to break it, right? They want to find ways to poke holes in, you know, the code and trying to find things that could go wrong. So they're going to come up with all the alternate scenarios, all the negative scenarios, all the exception paths, all the ways it could go wrong. And that's a very different mindset from business analysts. So you have to think of them, I think of them definitely as two different professions completely, but they overlap a lot. And depending on the size of your organization and, you know, the funding, you may have a lot of BAs that do QA work. So one example I would give is about a year ago, I did a almost year-long engagement at an insurance company, and they had a huge set of BAs, but they didn't have any QA people. Their BAs were their QA too. So I thought that was an interesting choice, probably not the best one for a company of that size, but it's not an uncommon practice for businesses to lump those together.
Yeah, very true. I was going to
Right.
say that in places where I've worked, very often I have no official BA area or titles or anyone in that space, and it starts to bleed over into, well, for BI, I'm having to do it all my BA work myself, or it'll be, well, these QA people are really your BA people because they're out there knowing what the business needs and they're testing out our software. So suddenly I'm turning to the QA people for BA stuff, and it's
That's
very
interesting.
it's very revealing to me when you kind of point out, Rachel, that the different mindsets that those roles provide. I can see why um, the BA type of help I got from a QA person was very different.
Yeah,
So
I would imagine. Yeah, they come from a very different mindset than business analysts. They're very detailed in their, their work. They're meticulous is what I would say. And BAs are very detail oriented too, but they are more business oriented. So they're more, thinking in the perfect sunny days, another word or phrase you could use for that happy path. That's I think where most BAs live in their heads.
This is Danelle, Rachel, you've done an amazing job presenting. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to add a little bit to that exposure that
Absolutely.
I've had.
Hmm.
What I've liked to do in the past, and for everyone else, I've been a BA for over 20 years. What I've done a lot is when we do have the two teams where we have the BAs and we have QA, I'll take QA along with me up front. So Rachel spoke about having a scribe if you can for some of your sessions. Usually because of our timelines, BAs are heavy, whether even if you're agile, we're usually heavy toward the beginning of an initiative, and then QA is kind of at the tail end. So if you partner up BA and QA together, you bring your QA person along with you to help you elicit requirements and have them possibly scribe, which would be their initial scripts eventually. The user
Hmm.
same notes for that. And then when you move forward on in the project where a BA's role kind of slows down a little bit and it's heavier on the testing, then we kick in and we help them with their testing as well. And you get that different mindset that Rachel was talking about. Nothing gets through between a BA and a QA working together.
Totally. And Danelkas, that's exactly what I just did on my project that I'm wrapping up right now.
It
We
is
brought
awesome.
we brought the QA along at the beginning, so he was there from the beginning, hearing all the, conversations with the product owner, and we are running agile, so we basically had a daily session with the product owner, so he was there to get the whole context, to understand the business need, the reasons behind the project, and exactly what you're saying. The other BA, the lead BA on the project, now he's basically winding down on any new requirements, and he's kicking in full bore on helping with testing because we need it. So it's exactly correct. Great example.
It just makes the team that much more efficient.
It does. And especially on agile teams, you want to have that kind of T shape, right? You want to have an expertise in some area, but you also want to have the ability to flex and do other things. So I can do UX design. I used to be a web designer, right? I could totally do that. I could totally do testing. I could probably even do a little, SQL coding. Don't tell anybody about that though.
I hear
So
you. I feel the same.
yeah, so I mean, being flexible and adaptable as a BA is probably your number one asset, I think, besides, having some basic skills and growing. Any other questions?
let's see. One question I had that occurred to me at the beginning related to that kind of upfront analysis, and you got into it a bit. when we talked about how it can be. I was like, wow, this is a lot of good stuff, but I've not ever felt at the companies I worked at where that's been encouraged. The amount of time it takes for some of that is often discouraged. Like, no, I just want to fill out a form with some what fields I want on the report, and I don't want to talk about this anymore. So
That's funny. And I used to, back before I got into Agile, I would always use the analogy of a building. And in waterfall, this is very true. Just like building a house, you wouldn't want to start without a blueprint or a design and understand this, sequence of how things had to be built and et cetera. And I would equate that to, here's these requirements specifications, and you need to invest the time or you're going to get something really bad as a result. So you have to educate the organization if they're not willing to invest that, because regardless of whether you're doing traditional or predictive, agile, I'm sorry, adaptive, it's you still have to have those conversations and make sure that you're understanding what it is you're building.
Yep.
You can't just go in there blind.
Yeah, you've kind of inspired me with this. A lot of places I've worked don't have BAs. There is no BA layer.
Mhm.
And part of it has been in the BI space, trying to do that ourselves. And
Right.
so I'm kind of like, okay, I'm going to use this now, this material, to kind of introduce the idea of business analysis as the precursor to getting into what we can give you for business intelligence. And that's why
Absolutely.
we're going to be interviewing you and identifying stakeholders and trying to do the RACI and the
Mhm.
value of all of that.
Yeah,
Because
absolutely.
because I think it's been a stumbling block in terms of really getting people to get a value out of business intelligence,
Mhm.
because there hasn't been anyone trying to explain BA work to them up front, and it's pretty crucial for successful BI projects to have more of this kind of analysis and
Yeah,
tools.
absolutely.
So
I would say it's essential for any kind of IT project. I mean, really, sometimes you have to sell the value proposition of a BA. And
mhm.
initially, organizations are resistant to that. I don't know if the guy from Schreiber Foods is still on, but I'll tell you guys a little story. I was brought into that company as a consultant, a BA consultant, a long time ago, probably back when I started in at Skyline. It was like one of my first assignments up in Green Bay, and they had no BAs. They
Mhm.
had a couple, like maybe one or two project managers, and then a whole floor full of both developers and IT managers. They had no BAs. So I was brought in to prove out the role of the BA. And interestingly, I gave a presentation at another IIB chapter up in Northeast Wisconsin sometime last year, I believe. And one of the people that I had sort of trained up as a BA, that was part of my gig, was to, share my BA skill set with some of their developers. Um, One of them I had trained, and she approached me, and I was just amazed to learn that they, at that point in time, had more than a dozen BAs. So they recognized the value, they funded the role, and I'm sure that, they're seeing the value of it, or they wouldn't have hired, that many people. So yeah, selling the BA value proposition can be challenging, but I think, there are many good ways to do that.
Yep. Nice. Any other questions? There hasn't been any typed into the chat. Feel free to unmute right now. Don't just disappear on us. I want to make certain we get some decent questions and wrap up.
I
Any
saw
other questions?
I think had one earlier or had her hand up.
Keisha had a hand up. Are you still having a question? Oh, okay. All right.
Well, it's been my pleasure. Thanks, you guys.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for coming on and giving us a great presentation. I'm going to clap into my microphone because we
Thank
can't
you.
do that for you in person, but it's awesome to have had you. I really appreciate it when you come to our meetup. We get great questions, great attendance from people coming to hear more about that whole BA side. It's really interlinked with BI and our data analytics, I think. So
Absolutely. Yep.
really nice to have those topics come to us. So,
Yes, my pleasure. I
well,
hope I can come again.
Please do. This will wrap up your presentation. Before anybody starts skedaddling out, take a moment to look at that participant list. We don't have as much opportunity for us to say hi and I get to do my thing where I get all of you to make a connection before we leave the room. So instead, look at that list. I've found that people's names are right there. Look everybody up on LinkedIn and make a connection. If you've met that person in our meetup before and they kind of operate in a similar space and you want to connect with them, it's easy to look somebody up on LinkedIn and reference that you met at our meetup. And hopefully people are accepting those connections when they come in on LinkedIn. I know I sent out at least a few tonight. So hopefully everybody got something out of this tonight, and we'll come to our next one. Just to recap that, Nicole, that is in July. Nicole, help me. Nicole?
Yeah, it's, yeah, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah, it's July 14th.
there we go.
And again, that's Nikhil Aurora with Schneider talking about their data analytics and data science journey.
Excellent. Thanks everybody for seeing us through, and everybody have a great evening and stay safe.